The news broke just as the world was waking up. In New York, traders were pouring their first cup of coffee. In London, market screens were flickering to life. And across Asia, the sun was rising when a single headline appeared and sent a ripple through global agriculture. Burkina Faso had signed a $14 billion grain agreement with India, guaranteeing 20 million tons of maize and sorghum over the next decade. For a landlocked West African nation long overlooked in global food discussions, this announcement felt almost unreal. Yet for families across Burkina Faso, it carried a meaning far deeper than numbers and charts. In a small village near Koudougou, a farmer named Amadou stepped out into the morning light as his battery-powered radio repeated the headline again and again. He had spent his life coaxing grain from dry soil, never imagining that his country might one day influence food prices in New Delhi or spark debate in Chicago's commodity pits. But as he listened, he realized something had shifted. His land, his labor, and the crops his father once grew quietly for local markets were now tied to a global moment that no one could ignore. And for viewers following Africa news from thousands of miles away, especially older Americans who understand how one decision can change the fate of a nation, this story carries echoes of resilience and hard-won progress. If stories about unexpected transformations and bold leadership speak to you, stay with me, because what lies behind this grain agreement is far more than trade. It is a story about climate pressure, economic ambition, geopolitical strategy, and the determination of a country ready to redefine itself under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré. But before we understand why India made this move and why global markets reacted with such intensity, we must look at the deeper truth. This deal did not appear overnight. It began years earlier in quiet meetings, difficult questions, and a vision that few believed possible. When the $14 billion grain agreement finally became public, most people assumed it was nothing more than a high-stakes business transaction. But the truth behind this deal is far more complex and reveals how deeply climate pressure, economic vulnerability, and strategic ambition now shape global food markets. For years, India has struggled with a food system that rises and falls with the monsoon, and in decades past, that cycle was manageable. But as climate change accelerates, nearly 8 of the last 15 monsoon seasons have shown irregular patterns that strained supply chains and pushed food prices dangerously high. India is a grain giant on paper, producing hundreds of millions of tons of wheat, rice, maize, and sorghum. Yet the country remains at the mercy of storage losses, drought shocks, and rising demand from a population exceeding 1.4 billion people. A single failed monsoon can send markets into panic. When Burkina Faso approached India with a proposal 3 years ago, Indian officials immediately recognized an unusual advantage. Burkina Faso's rainfall pattern does not mirror India's, meaning that a climate shock in Asia does not automatically translate into a weak harvest in West Africa. For India, this difference represented a form of climate insurance, a buffer against unpredictable weather. But the initial conversations were not based on numbers. They were built on trust. Indian envoys traveled quietly into Burkina Faso's central plains, walking through storage silos, inspecting farms, and interviewing growers who had never before spoken with foreign trade advisors. One of those farmers was a man named Idrissa, a father of 5, whose family has cultivated maize for generations. When asked whether Burkina Faso could truly sustain production for 10 years, he answered, with a calm but firm conviction, that the land could deliver more than the world believed if given the right tools and investment. His confidence stayed with the Indian delegation long after they returned home. Slowly, trust deepened. Step by step, India realized that partnering with Burkina Faso would diversify its supply in a way no other country could offer. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso saw in India something it had rarely found in global trade partners: a nation willing to build infrastructure rather than impose political conditions. India proposed modernizing Burkina Faso's storage silos, upgrading irrigation canals, and introducing new grain preservation technology to avoid the post-harvest losses that have long plagued African farmers. This was not simply a purchase agreement, but a development partnership designed to strengthen both economies. As Africa News began reporting early rumors of the negotiations, rival grain exporters in South America and Eastern Europe grew uneasy. For decades, they had dominated Asian grain imports, but now a new competitor was emerging from a region they had never considered a threat. Grain analysts noted that if Burkina Faso exported 2 million tons per year to India, even small shifts in global supply could pressure other exporters to lower prices or renegotiate contracts. The scale of the deal signaled a rebalancing of global food security. Markets reacted instantly because the implications were enormous. Burkina Faso was not merely exporting grain. It was gaining international recognition as an agricultural force, something unimaginable a decade ago when the country was known primarily for gold mining and political unrest. And yet, this deal also exposed enormous logistical challenges. A landlocked country exporting millions of tons of grain to the other side of the world seems impossible at first glance. But India and Burkina Faso approached this obstacle not as a barrier, but as a shared engineering problem. Together, they coordinated new railway upgrades, expanded port storage capacity in neighboring coastal nations, and improved cross-border road networks. What appeared impossible became feasible through strategic cooperation. This alone told the world that the agreement was not a publicity stunt or a temporary arrangement. It was a long-term partnership shaped by vision and necessity. If this moment reminds you of a time in your own life when a single decision transformed an entire future, your perspective matters, because what Burkina Faso and India set in motion will shape global markets for years. Yet even with all these developments, the most important question is one the world has not fully answered. Why did India choose Burkina Faso over larger, wealthier, and more established exporters? The answer reveals the political and geopolitical motivations that made this deal inevitable. The real turning point in this historic grain deal emerged when global analysts began digging deeper into the motivations behind India's sudden pivot toward Burkina Faso. And what they discovered sent shockwaves through markets and diplomatic circles alike. For years, India had relied heavily on large exporters like Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine, and Australia, trusting their scale and long-standing trade routes. But this trust was shaken repeatedly as war, drought, fertilizer shortages, and global supply disruptions exposed how fragile even the biggest agricultural systems had become. When India quietly began exploring alternative suppliers, it found something unexpected in the heart of West Africa. Burkina Faso, despite being landlocked, had a uniquely resilient climate cycle. While India's monsoon had grown unpredictable, Burkina Faso's rainfall patterns had remained more consistent across the last decade, making it a perfect counterbalance to India's boom and bust food cycles. This realization pushed the grain agreement from a technical conversation into a strategic priority. But the most dramatic moment came when India's internal climate risk assessment leaked to international observers, revealing that its long-term food security plans were dangerously exposed. According to the findings, a 3-year sequence of weak monsoons could destabilize food prices for hundreds of millions of Indians. That report, once circulated, made the partnership with Burkina Faso look less like a choice and more like a necessity. Africa News called it a pivotal reconfiguration of global food insurance. And overnight, the world treated Burkina Faso not as a minor player, but as a nation capable of influencing the stability of Asia's food supply chain. Inside Burkina Faso, the reaction was emotional. Farmers who had long felt invisible now saw their livelihoods linked to one of the world's largest economies. In a village near Tenkodogo, an elderly farmer named Salifu told a reporter that he had never imagined his sorghum field would matter to people living 10,000 kilometers away. With tears in his eyes, he said that for the first time, he felt that the world finally understood the value of African soil. His story spread across West African radio stations and touched many older Americans who remembered eras when small communities suddenly found themselves essential to national security. If you have ever seen an overlooked community rise to importance because of courage and determination, then you understand why this moment resonated far beyond the Sahel. But excitement was not the only reaction. A different wave of concern poured in from grain-producing regions across the world. In South America, exporters warned that the India-Burkina Faso partnership could trigger long-term shifts in global demand. In Eastern Europe, where war disruptions had already strained agricultural shipments, analysts feared losing critical Asian customers. Commentators in Brussels even raised the question of whether this agreement might accelerate a new era of food geopolitics, where nations form exclusive, climate-based supply alliances. As the world debated the consequences, the political dimension of the deal became impossible to ignore. India's choice of Burkina Faso was not just economic. It was a statement about partnership. India did not ask for military concessions, voting alignments, or political conditions. Instead, it offered technology, infrastructure, and farmer training. That alone set this agreement apart from other global powers, whose trade deals often came with strings attached. Ibrahim Traoré understood this advantage. By positioning Burkina Faso as a trustworthy, equal partner, he signaled to the world that his nation was ready to define its own future on its own terms. This bold stance drew both admiration and criticism. Critics argued that relying too heavily on a single buyer could be risky. Supporters countered that no African nation had ever used agricultural strategy so effectively to elevate itself onto the global stage. As debate intensified, financial markets continued reacting. Commodity strategists in Chicago pointed out that if Burkina Faso successfully delivered even half of the promised volumes, global grain pricing models would need to be rewritten. At the same time, humanitarian observers raised questions about whether domestic food supplies would remain secure. The government responded by reassuring citizens that a fixed portion of national grain output would be reserved for local families. But the tension between global opportunity and domestic protection lingered in the air. This was not just a trade deal. It was a test of whether a nation could rise without leaving its people behind. And just when analysts believed they understood the full complexity of the agreement, a final revelation emerged that changed everything. India did not choose Burkina Faso simply for grain. It chose Burkina Faso because of a geopolitical shift that few saw coming, and that shift would soon reshape alliances across the entire global South. As the $14 billion grain partnership between India and Burkina Faso took shape, the deeper social and political implications inside Burkina Faso began to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. For millions of families across the Sahel, this agreement represented not just an economic breakthrough, but a shift in identity, a moment when a country long defined by drought, conflict, and underinvestment suddenly found itself at the center of global agricultural strategy. The most immediate consequence was psychological. Farmers who had spent decades fighting unpredictable seasons finally saw their work recognized on the world stage, and this recognition carried tremendous emotional weight. In a village near Kaya, a schoolteacher named Musa explained that many of his students had grown up believing their futures were limited to subsistence farming or migration. But after the India deal, he noticed something new in their eyes, a sense that their land mattered and that their country had a place in the global future. This emotional transformation was as important as the economic one, because hope changes behavior. When people believe their nation has a future, they invest more in their communities, take fewer risks with migration, and begin imagining themselves as part of something larger. At the same time, the government of Burkina Faso faced a critical challenge. The world was watching to see whether it could balance massive exports with domestic food security. In response, leaders implemented strict measures ensuring that a guaranteed portion of national grain production would remain inside the country. Analysts on Africa News emphasized that this safeguard was essential in preventing shortages and maintaining confidence among ordinary citizens who feared rising prices. The government also committed a portion of the deal's revenue to local food price stabilization and irrigation expansion, a strategy designed to boost total grain output so that exports and domestic consumption could both be satisfied. Yet even with these protections, the political debate intensified. Supporters of Ibrahim Traoré celebrated the deal as evidence of visionary leadership, arguing that Burkina Faso was finally stepping out of the shadow of dependency and positioning itself as a self-determined agricultural power. Critics, however, questioned whether the nation was ready for such a massive responsibility. They warned that any failure in logistics, drought, or market fluctuation could spark political pressure at home. Despite these concerns, evidence of progress began to appear quickly. New road networks were drafted, railway upgrades accelerated, and port facilities in neighboring countries began preparing for increased traffic. Investment in storage silos and grain drying technology expanded rapidly, creating jobs for thousands of young Burkinabe. These developments offered a glimpse of what a more connected and prosperous Burkina Faso might look like. Politically, the impact was even more significant. In West Africa, the deal triggered a wave of ambition among neighboring states. Mali, Niger, and Chad began discussing their own agricultural export potential. For decades, African nations were told they lacked infrastructure, scale, or reliability to become major food exporters. Burkina Faso shattered that narrative. It proved that even a landlocked nation could rise if given the chance to build equal partnerships. On the global stage, the agreement altered perceptions of the Sahel. Rather than viewing the region solely through lenses of conflict or instability, international observers began viewing it as a potential agricultural frontier. Development organizations noted that if more African countries followed Burkina Faso's example, global food supply would diversify, reducing dependence on a small number of exporters and making the world more resilient to climate shocks. Still, not everything was positive. Competitors in South America and Eastern Europe warned that the rise of West African exporters could trigger strategic price wars. Political analysts questioned whether India's involvement might reshape alliances in the region. And humanitarian groups cautioned that despite new optimism, millions in Burkina Faso still faced poverty and needed the government to prevent inequality from widening. If you have ever watched a community rise from hardship and try to build a better life while carrying the weight of high expectations, you understand the delicate balance Burkina Faso now faces. Society is changing, politics are shifting, and the entire region is adapting to a new identity that mixes pride with responsibility. And yet, beneath all the optimism and uncertainty, a larger question remains hovering over the future of the Sahel. What role will the world's major powers play now that Burkina Faso has stepped into the spotlight? The answer lies in the next phase of this story, where India's ambitions, global competition, and the future of the global South collide in a way few could have imagined. As the $14 billion grain agreement between India and Burkina Faso rippled across global markets, Washington and major world capitals began examining what this partnership meant for the future of international food security and geopolitical alignment. American analysts quickly recognized that this was not simply a trade arrangement, but a strategic shift, showing how nations are adapting to a world shaped by climate instability and unpredictable supply chains. For the United States, which has long invested in global food stability to protect its own national security interests, the deal raised two critical questions. First, what does India see in Burkina Faso that the rest of the world has overlooked for so long? And second, could this partnership influence regional stability in ways that matter to America's long-term strategic outlook? India's move demonstrated a keen understanding of climate diversification, something U.S. security researchers have discussed for years. By linking its food supply to a region with a different rainfall pattern and a rising agricultural potential, India reduced the possibility that climate shocks would strike both nations at the same time. In Washington, this was viewed as a smart defensive maneuver. Meanwhile, global observers took note of Ibrahim Traoré's assertive diplomacy. At a time when many nations across Africa are redefining their foreign partnerships, Burkina Faso's choice to work closely with India signaled a new orientation toward South-to-South cooperation. In Europe, officials expressed concern that long-standing relationships with West African suppliers could weaken as new economic alliances form. In South America and Eastern Europe, exporters feared losing market share and political influence in Asia. Africa News reported that some countries even rushed to renegotiate contracts to maintain their position in India's import portfolio. Yet despite these apprehensions, many American experts praised the deal as a stabilizing force. Strengthening West Africa's agricultural capacity reduces the risk of food-related conflict, lowers migration pressure, and encourages economic independence, all outcomes that align with U.S. interests. If this moment reminds you of earlier decades when new partnerships emerged from unexpected places and reshaped global dynamics, your perspective is part of a larger conversation about how nations adapt to the challenges of an uncertain world. Still, there is one question that now dominates discussions in Washington, New Delhi, and across the Sahel. How will this new alliance influence the next era of global competition? The answer will determine whether this deal becomes a model for future cooperation or the spark that ignites a reshaping of power across the global South. As the $14 billion grain partnership between India and Burkina Faso settles into the global landscape, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This agreement is more than trade, more than economies, and more than a bold diplomatic statement. It is a turning point in how nations safeguard their future. In an age where climate uncertainty, political instability, and shifting alliances make old assumptions obsolete. The years ahead will test whether Burkina Faso can deliver on its promise while protecting its own people, and whether India can build the infrastructure and long-term commitment needed for the partnership to thrive. Analysts warn that climate shocks, regional tensions, or price swings could challenge both sides. Yet for millions of families across the Sahel, the meaning of this deal is not measured in markets, but in the possibilities it opens. In villages from Kaya to Tenkodogo, parents hope that modern irrigation will keep their fields alive and their children fed even in the driest years. In India, millions rely on stable grain supplies to keep food affordable. And in both nations, this agreement has already inspired a belief that cooperation built on respect rather than pressure can produce outcomes that benefit ordinary people. Global observers are watching closely. Some predict that this partnership will spark a wave of South-to-South economic alliances. Others warn that larger players may try to influence or disrupt this new balance. If this story reminds you of earlier moments in history, when unlikely partners reshaped their destiny through courage and faith, then your reflections matter, because in times of change, the wisdom of those who have lived through many eras carries weight. If this journey has moved you or made you reflect on the values of dignity, responsibility, and the hope that every family deserves a fair chance, share your thoughts. Your voice becomes part of a wider dialogue about justice and stability in a world that is often uncertain. The question now is simple but profound. Will this grain partnership become a foundation for a more stable global food system? Or will it become a test of resilience for two nations facing the pressures of a changing world? Time will reveal the truth, but until then, may God guide the people of Burkina Faso, the people of India, and every nation striving for peace, security, and a future shaped not by fear, but by cooperation and courage.